thing vel-sothari said to me. Before she had asked my name or checked my candidacy record or confirmed I was even standing in the right annex was this: "You believe the Prohibition is theater." She had her back to me. She was doing something with a flat plate reader at the far end of the archive room. The kind of work that does not require an audience. The room was cold. The Veldrath Academy's restricted annex ran 10 degrees colder than the rest of the compound. They said it was for the preservation of the physical record media kept here, the old plated charts and the crystal lattice data cores from before the Confederation standardized its filing formats. I heard other candidates say the cold was intentional in a different way, that it was meant to slow you down, make the body feel the weight of what was stored. I had not believed that either. "I believe the Prohibition is outdated administrative policy," I said. "Possibly well-founded at the time of its original designation. Possibly not. I am here to determine which." Vel-sothari set the reader down on the rack beside her and turned. She was not what I had expected. The records listed her as a senior cartographer, second rank, attached to the Academy's Hall of Excluded Designations, as an archivist instructor. What that description had not prepared me for was the way she looked at me. Not with hostility, not with the performed weariness of an elder tired of young officers, but with something that sat below both. Something patient and absolutely still. "Thesis proposal," she said. "You submitted it to the candidacy board 14 days ago. Title: The Prohibition on Human Space as a Function of Political Mythology. Structural analysis of border designations maintained without contemporary justification." The board forwarded it here. I know where the board forwarded it. And you know why? Because any thesis engaging the Prohibition must be supervised by a certified exclusion archivist. Yes. I read the candidacy handbook. Vel-sothari walked to the center of the room. The archive annex was not large, perhaps 30 strides from the entrance to the far wall, lined on both sides with sealed plate racks, and the flat rectangular housings of the lattice core library. There were 3 chairs and a long narrow table. Nothing else. The only light came from the ceiling strips and the faint amber indicators on the sealed rack housings, a row of small lights that told you the temperature inside each rack was holding. The room smelled of cold metal and whatever compound the Confederation used to treat the plate storage casings. "Old, preserved, sealed. Sit down," Vel-sothari said. I sat. She pulled one of the other chairs to the end of the table nearest me and sat without the distance an instructor usually keeps. That surprised me. I was ready for a lecture. I was ready for the standard recitation. The Prohibition's designation date, the incursion record, the empty return statistics that every Dravathi officer candidate memorizes before the end of their second year. I had heard the recitation. I had written a 30-page structural critique of it. I did not need to hear it again. "You are not going to argue with me about statistics," I said. "No," she said. "Then what are we doing here?" She looked at me for a moment. Not studying me. She had already studied me, I understood that later. This was something else. This was her deciding something. "I am going to show you something," she said. 3 sessions, today, tomorrow, and the day after. At the end of the 3rd session, you will either continue your thesis as written, or you will not. Either outcome is acceptable to me. I am not here to change your mind. I am here to make certain that whatever position you hold at the end of these sessions, you hold it having seen what there is to see. What are you going to show me?" She reached across the table and placed on it a single data chip. Small, gray, the standard Confederation archive format, the kind used for recording media that predated the lattice core system. "The vel-sothari survey," she said. "The unedited record." I knew the vel-sothari survey. Every Dravathi officer candidate knew the vel-sothari survey. It was one of 4 major incursion events cited in the Prohibition's official designation file, the most recent one occurring 41 years ago, the only one from which any vessel returned. A survey fleet of 9 ships, dispatched by the vel-sothari Exploratory Compact, crossed the Prohibition boundary under the Compact's claim that the Prohibition applied only to military incursion and not to registered scientific survey. The Confederation had disputed that interpretation. The Compact had proceeded anyway. One ship came back, the Sarathavain. 87 days after it crossed the boundary, it returned with its communications array sealed. its navigation records encrypted to a classification level that the compact itself did not hold, and its crew reduced by 2/3. The official Confederation summary of the survey's findings was 11 sentences long. It had been 11 sentences long for 41 years. Quests for the unedited record had been denied on 17 separate occasions, most recently 8 years ago. I looked at the data chip on the table. "That is the unedited record," I said. It was not a question. "The Sarathavane's complete log," vel-sothari said. "Communications, internal recording, the full 87 days. How do you have it?" She did not answer that. She reached across the table, picked the chip up, and inserted it into the reader housing set into the table's surface. A display panel rose from the table's center, the old keened, amber light, rather than the flat projection of the modern readers. "I was on the Sarathavane," she said. She was not looking at me when she said it. She was looking at the display panel as it initialized. First session lasted 4 hours. I did not speak for most of it. Vel-sothari said very little either. She had seen this before. She did not need to narrate it for herself. And she had learned, I think, not to narrate it for the person watching. You watched. You came to your own understanding, or you did not. She was there to answer questions, not to guide interpretation. What I saw in those 4 hours was the first 32 days of the vel-sothari survey's approach to human space. It did not look like what I had expected a forbidden zone to look like. That was the first thing the survey noted, too. The survey commander, a vel-sothari named Drethar Vaughn, recorded it on the 3rd day after crossing the boundary line. I will try to put his words here as accurately as I can, though the transcript notation in the archive is in the compact's old phonetic system, and I may not have every nuance. Sector appears nominal. Standard stellar density for this region of the arm. No anomalous readings. No beacon warning systems. No patrols. If this sector is forbidden, it is forbidden only by convention. We find no physical enforcement. He noted the absence of debris. No wreckage of previous incursions. No evidence that the 8 survey ships lost in earlier incursions recorded in the Confederation's public file had passed this way. The sector looked clean. It looked, in Drethar Vaughn's words, like any other uncontested region. He was pleased. His communications officer, a woman named Seveldrath, wrote a personal log entry on the same day. Her entry was 11 words. The sector looks like any other region. That worries me. Vel-sothari stopped the playback there. She was right to be worried, I said. It felt inadequate. She was right about why, vel-sothari said. We watched the survey continue inward. The first weeks were uneventful. Survey protocols, stellar readings, the ordinary cataloging work of a scientific fleet operating in a region that had, to Drethar Vaughn's visible satisfaction, no observable hazards. The 8 other ships of the fleet filed their daily reports. The commander's tone grew steadily more confident, then something approaching vindicated. He noted, on day 16, that the Confederation's prohibition appeared to be founded on rumor, precedent, and the administrative convenience of maintaining a large border zone. Without the expense of detailed survey, he drafted a preliminary recommendation that the compact petition the Confederation to re-examine the designation. He was going to submit it on return. He seemed, in those recordings, genuinely excited. He had proven something. On day 29, the Sarathavane sensor officer reported an anomaly, not a ship, not a weapon, not a signal. An anomaly in the background electromagnetic profile of the sector. A faint, structured variation that repeated on a very long cycle, something between 22 and 24 hours. Too regular to be natural, too faint and too spread to triangulate to a single source. It was, the sensor officer noted, as though the sector itself has a heartbeat. I sat with that phrase. I felt vel-sothari watching me as I sat with it, though when I glanced at her she was not watching me. She was watching the display. Her expression unchanged, which was its own kind of information. Drethar Vaughn's response to the anomaly report was to direct his sensor team to continue cataloging it. He did not alter course. He did not increase alert status. He noted in the command log that the anomaly was interesting and worthy of further study. He scheduled a full fleet briefing for day 32. The briefing never happened. On day 31, the 3rd ship in the fleet, the Karthari Vel, a mid-range survey vessel carrying 22 crew, stopped transmitting. Not a distress signal, not a farewell. It stopped transmitting mid-sentence, in the middle of a routine position report. The last words in its log were the communications officer's voice, calling out a course correction for a debris avoidance maneuver. The sentence was incomplete. The transmission ended. The Carthari Vel did not respond to hails. Arthur Vane ordered the Saratha Vane and the nearest ship to alter course and investigate. They found nothing. Not wreckage, not a debris field, a beacon. Not bodies, not hull fragments. Not the particular scatter pattern of material that every spacefaring civilization learns to recognize as the remains of a vessel that has come apart under stress. The Carthari Vel had been in that position. It had been there, its 22 crew alive, and filing position reports. And then it was not there. The sector showed no evidence that it had ever been there at all. The search lasted 11 hours. Drether Vaughn expanded the search grid 3 times, each expansion covering the furthest plausible drift distance for a vessel that had gone dark, without power. Nothing. The Saratha Vane's sensor officer checked and rechecked the baseline readings. He filed a formal notation that his equipment was functioning within normal parameters. The ship was simply not there. The first session ended there, on day 32 of the survey log, with Drether Vaughn's voice in the recording making the entry about the Carthari Vel into the command log, his tone entirely controlled. The practiced neutral cadence of a survey commander who has had emergency training and is applying it. Underneath the training, in the careful pauses before certain words, before nothing, before no debris, before no indication, I heard the thing that the training was working to contain. He did not know what had happened. That was the part that stayed with me after vel-sothari switched off the display panel and told me the session was finished. Not the disappearance itself. Disappearances happen. Ships are lost. Space offers 1,000 ways for a vessel to cease existing and leave no trace. Stayed with me was the commander's voice in those pauses. Drether Vaughn had spent his career in survey work. He had seen ships lost. He had protocols for it. He had language for it. The official language of loss and investigation and orderly response. What he did not have language for was this particular quality of absence. The Carthari Vel was not lost. It had not exploded or broken apart or been consumed by an anomalous gravitational event. It had simply stopped being present in a sector where nothing had taken it. The language for loss assumes something that caused the loss. Drether Vaughn was making his log entry into a grammar that did not have a structure for "it was here," and then it was not, and the sector shows no evidence either way. That was the first session. I walked back to my quarters through the Academy's outer corridor, in the dark that the Veldrath station maintains between the 18th and 6th hours, and I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had expected to feel resistant, to find in the record some purchase for the argument I had already made, some evidence of selective editing or administrative framing that would allow me to maintain my thesis position. I did not feel resistant. I felt something that I later identified as the first stage of understanding, which is not the same thing as believing. Free. I understood that what I had watched for 4 hours was a record of people encountering something they had no category for, that the survey commander's controlled voice, making entries about the Carthari Vel, was the sound of a taxonomy failing in real time. I told myself that was not proof of anything. I told myself the disappearance might have a dozen explanations that were not mythic or forbidden in nature. A singular event, a collision with something small and dense, a catastrophic system failure that left no debris. Ships had been lost with no physical explanation before. The Carthari Vel was one data point. A pattern required more. The pattern was coming. Return to the annex at the appointed time the next morning. The second session lasted 5 hours. vel-sothari began it without ceremony. She inserted the chip, brought up the panel, and moved the log forward to day 33. In the 2 days between the end of session 1 and now, I had thought carefully about what I knew of the vel-sothari survey's official record. The 11-sentence summary stated that the fleet had encountered an unspecified event of significant lethality within the prohibited zone, that 8 of 9 ships were lost, that the Saratha Vane returned with a reduced crew and declined to submit a full report, and that the Confederation had reaffirmed the Prohibition's designation on the basis of the survey's outcome. 11 sentences. No detail, no cause, No description of what the unspecified event had been. Looking at those 11 sentences from the outside, as I had looked at them for 2 years before arriving at the academy, they appeared to be exactly what I had argued they were, the administrative minimum. The language of an institution that had decided to reaffirm a policy and needed a justification on record, not a genuine account of events. Looking at them now from the inside of the unedited log, I understood something different. The 11 sentences were not the minimum, because the Confederation had chosen to be minimal. They were the minimum because there was no language available that would have served as more. The second session was days 33 through 61. I will not try to describe all of it. Some of it I still do not have the right words for, and I have spent 20 years trying to find them. What I will say is this: the Carthari Vel was not the last ship the survey lost. Between day 33 and day 44, 4 more vessels disappeared from the fleet in the same manner. Present in the record, absent in the sector, no wreckage, no distress signal, no entry in the background anomaly profile that would indicate when or how the loss occurred. Thar Vane's command log became, across those 11 days, a record of a man applying an increasingly inadequate framework to a situation that had moved entirely outside its parameters. The frameworks themselves were interesting. He went through them in order, which was also, I realized, the order in which a trained survey commander would exhaust his available interpretations. First, he considered navigational error. Perhaps the missing ships had altered course without logging the change and were simply displaced. He dispatched search patterns. They found nothing. Then he considered communication failure. Perhaps the ships were present but their transmitters failed simultaneously. He attempted direct visual scan. There was nothing to see. He considered the anomaly. Perhaps the sector's electromagnetic variation was interfering with sensor readings, producing a false absence. He cross-checked against every sensor array on the remaining ships. The sector registered as empty where the ships had been. On day 36, the second ship went, the Veth Dollar 12 crew mid-transmission. On day 38, the Soreth Vel 19 crew. On day 40, the Drev Khan 9 crew, the smallest vessel in the survey fleet. Running automated protocols for most of its transit, its crew concentrated in 2 compartments, all mid-transmission, all the same. All without explanation that the remaining sensor arrays could provide. After the Drev Khan, Trethervan stopped scheduling fleet briefings. The fleet was down to 5 ships. He moved them into a tighter formation and reduced the intership distance, as though proximity would help. In his command log, he noted this adjustment without explaining the reasoning. He did not need to explain it. Everyone on the Sarathivane's bridge understood. They were bunching together in a sector where something was taking ships. In the irrational and entirely human, I use the word loosely, because of course he was vel-sothari, not human. The entirely mortal instinct that presence of others provides some protection against forces you cannot see. It did not provide protection. On day 41, his communications officer Sivoldrath submitted a formal log entry. It was longer than her 11-word entry from day 3. She wrote, "I have been compiling the timing of the losses against the anomaly cycle. Correlation is not perfect. It is, however, present. Each loss has occurred within a 4-hour window centered on the anomaly's peak amplitude. I do not know what this means. I do not know if the anomaly is a cause, a marker, or a coincidence. I know that it is the only variable in this sector that is not behaving as expected. I have brought this to the commander's attention. He has noted it in the command log. He has not altered our course or speed." She paused in the recording and then added, "I want it on record that I recommended we turn around on day 33. I want it on record that I have recommended it every day since. It was on record. I was reading it 41 years later. Dretharvan did not turn around on day 41. He turned around on day 44, after the 5th ship vanished. It was the Keth Soreth 17 crew, the survey fleet's secondary science vessel, which had been running continuous anomaly mapping protocols for 11 days at Dretharvan's direction, trying to build a picture of whatever it was that cycled through the sector's electromagnetic baseline every 22 to 24 hours. The Keth Soreth disappeared at the peak of its most detailed anomaly reading cycle, in the middle of transmitting its findings to the Sarathivane. The transmission record showed the data was 43% complete when it ended. The remaining 57% of the anomaly data did not arrive. Drethar Vane ordered the remaining 4 vessels, the Saratha Vane, the vel-sothari, the Drathsorath, and the Soval Death, to reverse course and make best speed for the Prohibition boundary. No more survey work, no more anomaly tracking, no more search patterns for the missing. Whatever the survey had come to find, he was leaving it behind. The log from the turnaround showed something that the command entries could not fully contain: relief. Not in Drethar Vonsen's voice, his voice remained controlled throughout, but in the voices of the bridge crew that the internal recording captured in background. A brief, ragged exhalation when the course change was announced. Someone saying something in the vel-sothari secondary dialect that the Confederation's translator rendered simply as an affirmative. A yes, repeated twice. The sound of people who had been holding themselves very still for a long time beginning, very cautiously, to move again. That sound made me feel something I had not expected to feel, watching a 41-year-old log record. It made me feel the weight of the relief, and underneath the weight of the relief, the size of what had produced it. They had been in that sector for 44 days, 5 ships gone, 5 ships with crews that the remaining officers had known, eaten with, worked alongside, exchanged daily transmissions with, and now they were running for the boundary, bunched together in a tight formation, watching the anomaly cycle on their sensor arrays and counting the hours until they crossed back into space that was not this space. 3 of the 4 ships made it to the boundary. The vel-sothari disappeared on day 58, 14 days into the return transit, with no warning in the middle of a routine navigation report. Same pattern, same absence. Drethar Von's log entry that day was 9 words. Vel-sothari is gone, we are not stopping. 9 words. I played them twice. He had 44 days of careful, controlled, professionally appropriate command log entries behind him. And after the 6th ship disappeared on the return run, he produced 9 words and nothing more. Not because he had stopped functioning, the navigation orders that followed were crisp and precise, but because the language had exhausted itself. The frameworks were gone. What remained was the course heading and the decision to maintain it. The Drathsorath disappeared on day 61. 6 days later, 11 crew, no warning, mid-transmission, that left the Saratha Vane and the Soval Death. vel-sothari stopped the playback. She sat back in her chair. The amber indicators on the seal racks ran their patient row of lights. The room was very cold. Day 61, I said. Day 61, she said. The Soval Death, I said. She nodded once. The Soval Death was the ship she had been on. I had not known that, before this moment, though I should have checked the crew manifest before the sessions began. I had been thinking of the record as a record, documents, logs, an archive. I had not been thinking carefully enough about who was in the room with me. I am sorry, I said. She did not respond to that. She looked at the display panel, which was still showing the frozen entry from day 61. Drethar Von's 9-word entry about the vel-sothari, the frame I had left it on. 26 of us made it back on the Saratha Vane, she said. We had taken on crew from the Drathsorath before it went. Drethar Von had ordered a transfer, when the pattern became clear, trying to consolidate. So the Saratha Vane had more crew on return than it left with. We were 61 on departure. We returned with 26. 26 people out of a fleet of 9 vessels that departed with a combined crew of 138. 112 dead, I said. Or missing. There is no missing, she said. Not in that sector. You have seen what missing means in that sector. I had. The session ends there, she said. The 3rd session is tomorrow. Get some rest. I did not rest well. That is all I will say about that night. Except that I will say a little more than that. Because the night between the 2nd and 3rd sessions was the night the thesis actually died, even though I did not formally withdraw it for another 2 days. I sat in my quarters for a long time with the lights off. Not because I intended to sleep and was waiting for it to come, but because the dark seemed more honest than the light. I had the particular awareness of a person who has just seen something that reorganizes the furniture in a room they thought they knew well. Not a single overturning, but a slow, irreversible rearrangement that shows you the room has always been a different shape from the one you were using. I thought about the Confederation Candidate Handbook's description of the Hall of Excluded Designations. 3 sentences. Facility maintaining restricted records pertaining to border designations of significant historical sensitivity. Required supervision for any thesis engaging those records. Contact the relevant archivist. 3 sentences that, read one way, meant exactly what they said, a bureaucratic filing requirement. Read another way. They were 11 sentences in miniature. The Confederation had been doing this for 500 years. They had been receiving incursion fleets back, the ones that came back, and they had been taking the records and sealing them and writing the minimum summary and maintaining the line. Not because they wanted to hide something sinister, because they understood at some institutional level that probably predated the people currently running the institution. The record had to be held in the form that could actually hold it. Full documentation was not more honest than 11 sentences. It was just more words applied to a thing that words could not adequately reach. And they kept vel-sothari. They kept a cartographer who had survived the Sarathavane's return, who had 30 years of accumulated understanding of what she had seen and what it meant. And they put her in a cold room with a data chip and a reader and a chair for the person sitting across from her. That was the full documentation system. Not a report, a person. The record in the form that language could not substitute for. I thought about Seveldrath. I had watched her across 87 days of log entries. Her 11-word entry on day 3. Her formal petition for the turnaround submitted every day from 33 onward. Her correlation analysis connecting the losses to the anomaly cycle. Her voice, reading the beacon's message aloud in the communications log. She had died on day 61, when the Soval death disappeared. She had been doing her job until then. The correlation analysis she filed on day 41, which no one on the Sarathavane had acted on when she submitted it, was the most accurate piece of analysis produced by the entire survey. I thought about the anomaly, the sector's heartbeat, pattern Seveldrath had identified, losses occurring within 4-hour windows centered on the anomaly's peak amplitude, that Drithar Vaughn had noted and not acted on. She had been right. The correlation was present. Whatever the anomaly was, whatever it marked or caused or accompanied, it cycled through the sector on its long period, and the losses followed its rhythm. And the beacon, placed 60 to 90 years before the survey arrived, placed for fleets that had not yet left. The beacon made no mention of the anomaly at all. No instructions to avoid the peak windows. No guidance on the cycle. Just, continue on your heading. You will reach the boundary in 14 days. We will not interfere with your departure. Either the beacon's authors did not think the anomaly information would help, or they did not think of it as information about a hazard that could be navigated around. The condition of the sector was not the anomaly. The anomaly was a symptom of the condition. You could know the timing of the cycle, and it would not protect you, because the sector was not a minefield with a predictable pattern. It was something else. I spent the hours between the second and third sessions in the way that I have come to understand, looking back, was probably inevitable, dismantling the argument I had built over 2 years of candidacy research, piece by piece, in the dark of my quarters, with the cold of the annex still in my clothes. The argument had been structurally sound. I had been careful with it. The Prohibition was an old designation, produced by a small number of incursion events, spread across 5 centuries, and the official record of each event was thin to the point of uselessness. No detailed cause of loss analyses, no surviving technical assessments from the vessels involved, no testimony from crew in any public form. A succession of brief, standardized official summaries that all said approximately the same thing. Ships entered, ships did not return, Prohibition reaffirmed, and provided nothing beyond that. The standard evidentiary analysis I had applied in the thesis draft showed a pattern consistent with institutional myth maintenance, rather than ongoing empirical assessment. Each reaffirmation of the Prohibition cited previous reaffirmations as its primary justification, producing a circular record that relied on its own age as evidence of its validity. That analysis was not wrong. The record had exactly the structure I had identified. What I had not understood until the second session was why. The record was thin, not because the events were invented, or institutionally manufactured. The record was thin because the events could not be described in language that served any useful purpose. You could write 11 sentences. You could write 11,000 sentences. Neither version would convey what Drethar Von's voice had conveyed in those pauses before nothing and debris. Neither version would transmit the sound of the Sarathavane's bridge crew exhaling when the course change was announced. The thin official record was not a choice made by bureaucrats who preferred convenient mythology to accurate documentation. It was the best available tool for the job. 11 sentences was what language could do with what had happened in that sector. I lay in my quarters and looked at the ceiling, and I thought about the data chip sitting in the reader housing, in the table, in the annex. I thought about what vel-sothari had said when I asked how she had it. She had not answered. She had said instead, I was on the Sarathavain. That was the answer. She had the record because she had been there. She was the record in the form that language could not hold. I went back to the annex the next morning, and I did not tell her any of this. It seemed beside the point. The third session was the one that ended my thesis. I arrived already understanding, somewhere below the level at which I usually process things, that whatever vel-sothari had been holding back for the third session was the reason the unedited log had been classified at a level above what the compact itself held. The first two sessions had given me the loss and the pattern and the inadequacy of frameworks, the disappearances, the anomaly, the ordered return that arrived too late for most of the fleet. That was terrible. That was a record of a catastrophe. Catastrophes get documented. Catastrophes get their full report, their public record, their place in the open canon of losses. The vel-sothari survey had not gotten any of that. 41 years of 11 sentences. There had to be something in the remaining log. Days 62 through 87, the Sarathavain running for the boundary with 26 survivors aboard. That explained why. Vel-sothari inserted the chip, brought up the display, and moved it forward to day 62. What I saw in the third session was not what I had been preparing myself for. I had been preparing myself for something about what had taken the ships. Some encounter, some communication, some glimpse of the thing operating in that sector. I had been building in my mind, across 2 days of watching frameworks fail, a picture of whatever it was that the vel-sothari survey had found. Something vast, something that moved without warning and left no wreckage. Something that had been in that sector for a very long time, patient and functional and indifferent. The third session was not about that. The third session was about what the Sarathavain encountered on day 72, 10 days into the return run, heading for the boundary at maximum sustainable speed. When the sensors picked up the first sign of human space that the survey had recorded. Weapon, not a fleet, not a connotation, a beacon, a marker buoy, the type that any spacefaring civilization places at its territorial boundary. Small, old. The Sarathavain sensor team estimated it had been in place for somewhere between 60 and 90 years, which meant it had been placed before the vel-sothari survey departed, and possibly before the Confederation had designated the Prohibition at all. It was broadcasting on a narrow band, a repeating signal, the kind designed to be received rather than answered. Drethar Von brought the Sarathavain to a halt and ordered the communications team to decode and translate. The signal was in 11 Galactic standard languages, cycling. The Sarathavain's translator could parse 4 of them. In all 4, the message was the same. I will transcribe it, as Seville Drath read it aloud in the communications log, because her voice is how I first received it, and her voice is what I still hear when I think about it now. You have entered a region under the protection of the human species. You have been observed since you crossed the boundary marker at this sector's outer edge. The losses you have sustained are not punishment. They are a consequence of the conditions this sector's history has produced. We do not pursue. We do not hunt. We defend. The distinction matters to us, though we understand it may not change your assessment of your situation. If you are receiving this message, you are close to the boundary. Continue on your present heading. Do not stop. Do not deviate. Do not attempt to communicate. You will reach the boundary in approximately 14 of your standard days at your current speed. We are aware of your presence. We will not interfere with your departure. Seville Drath's voice stopped. In the recording there was a long silence before Drethar Von spoke. What he said was not in the command log. It was in Seveldrath's personal record, because she had her own recorder running, as she had for the entire survey, he said. Quietly, to no one in particular, looking at the sector ahead of them on the navigation display, they watched us the entire time. Not what had done it, not what had taken 7 ships and over 100 crew. He went straight to the thing the beacon's message had made impossible to avoid. Whatever held that sector had been aware of the survey since the moment it crossed the boundary. It had watched them approach. It had watched Drethar Von make his log entries about the sector looking nominal, about the prohibition being administrative convention, about the absence of physical enforcement. It had watched him write his preliminary recommendation that the compact petition for a re-examination. It had watched 6 ships disappear and had waited, and then it had placed a marker buoy in their path. Had placed it decades ago, against exactly this eventuality, that told them they had been observed, that the losses were not random, and that they should continue on their current heading without stopping. Not, we are sorry for your losses. Not, we did not intend for this. Not, here is what you encountered and here is what it was. Just, you have been observed since you crossed the boundary. Continue, do not stop. You will reach the boundary in 14 days. I sat with the message for longer than the session required. Vel-sothari let me. There were things in some messages' language that I had to work through carefully, because the language was precise in ways that did not immediately reveal themselves. The losses you have sustained are not punishment. That sentence carried 2 pieces of information simultaneously. The first was a statement of intent, they are not punishing you, and the second, implicit and considerably heavier, was the acknowledgement that whatever had taken 7 ships was something they were aware of, something connected to them, in a way that allowed them to characterize its nature, to know what it was and what it was not. They knew the losses were not punishment, because they knew what punishment would look like, which meant they knew what the alternative was. They are a consequence of the conditions this sector's history has produced. Not an action, a condition, like a temperature, like a pressure differential. Like the kind of thing that happens in a region because of what that region has been, not because something in it chose to act. The sector was not a weapon, it was a result. The result of a history that had produced, as one of its byproducts, a region of space that did not respond well to certain categories of incursion, the way certain compounds produce toxic effects when introduced to certain environments. Not by decision but by chemistry. And then, do not pursue, we do not hunt, we defend. The distinction matters to us. That sentence was the one I returned to most, in the remaining hour of the session and in the days and years afterward. The distinction matters to us. Not we want you to understand the distinction, or the distinction is relevant to your safety. Both of which would be statements directed at the receiver, about how the receiver should process the information. The distinction matters to us, a statement about themselves, about the weight they assign to the difference between pursuit and defense. They had watched 112 people die in the conditions their history had produced, and they had reached out, or had reached out decades earlier in anticipation of exactly this moment, with a message that contained, in its 4th sentence, a statement about the kind of civilization they believed themselves to be. I did not know what to do with that. I still do not, entirely. Vel-sothari showed me the remaining 15 days of the log after I had sat with the message long enough. Sarathavane obeyed the instructions. Drethar Von did not attempt to scan for the beacon's origin point. He did not attempt to communicate. He logged position reports at regular intervals, navigational records, the standard operational entries of a vessel in transit. His voice in those entries was the flattest. I had heard it across the entire survey. Not controlled. The control had served its purpose and been set aside. What was underneath it was not panic or grief, but something quieter than both. Quality of awareness. A knowledge of being watched by something that had chosen, for reasons of its own, to let you leave. Seveldrath logged twice more in the transit. The first entry, on day 78, 6 sentences noting the sensor profile of the boundary region as it became visible ahead. The technical parameters. The estimated time to crossing. Competent. Professional. entirely beside the point of what was actually happening on that ship. Her second entry, day 85, 2 days before the boundary crossing, was 4 words. I think we qualify. I asked vel-sothari what that meant. She was quiet for a moment. Drath believed, she said, that the beacon's message was not a general warning placed for any incursion fleet that happened to stumble close enough to receive it. She believed it was specifically sent, or that the conditions for its reception were specifically arranged for fleets that had already sustained sufficient losses to demonstrate that they understood, at some level, what they had encountered, that the message was the sector's version of a judgment, not about what you came to do, or why, about whether you had paid enough attention to what the sector was showing you. I sat with that. And we qualified, I said. 7 ships out of 9, 112 crew. Drath thought yes, vel-sothari said. She thought the message was how the sector, or whatever tended the sector, communicated something, approximating mercy to the survivors of an incursion that had lasted long enough and cost enough that the survivors could be presumed to understand what they were leaving behind. That is a terrible way to grant mercy, I said. Yes, she said it is. On day 87, the Sarathavain crossed the Prohibition boundary into clear space. No fanfare, no confrontation, no final communication from the beacon or from whatever source had written the beacon's message. The sector behind them continued to look, on every sensor array the Sarathavain carried, exactly as it had looked since day 3 of the survey's approach. Nominal, standard stellar density, no anomalous readings, no beacon warning systems visible, no patrols and nothing behind them, no pursuit, no wreckage, no sign that 8 ships and over 100 crew had passed through that sector in the previous 87 days and not returned. The sector looked like any other uncontested region. Drath's last log entry on the survey record was made 4 hours after the boundary crossing. It was 43 words. I have been trying to identify what the sector felt like for the last 26 days. I think the word is tended, not guarded, not patrolled, not defended in the way a border is defended. It felt like something that was being looked after. We were allowed to leave. I do not know why. Vel-sothari stopped the display. Chips sat in the reader housing in the table. The amber indicators on the seal racks held their patient row. The room was cold and still. He sat for a long time without speaking. Vel-sothari did not speak either. She had the particular stillness of someone who has said everything they need to say and is now simply present. The message, I said finally, beacon. It said the losses were not punishment, that they were a consequence of conditions the sector's history had produced. Yes, what does that mean? Vel-sothari looked at me. It means, she said slowly, as though she had been deciding for a long time whether to say this, the sector does what it does not because something in it is hostile. It means the sector does what it does because of what it has been, because of what humans have been. They did not build a weapon system and station it at their border. They did not place a fleet on patrol. They did not need to. Something in the history of that species, in what they have passed through, in what they have done to survive, has made the sector itself, into the Galactic's taxonomy of threats, has no column for. Beacon said the losses were a consequence of conditions, I said. Not an action, not a weapon, she said, not a decision. A condition. The way extreme cold is a condition. The way a star's radiation output is a condition. The sector produces a certain outcome for certain kinds of incursion, the way a vacuum produces a certain outcome for an unprotected organism. Does not decide, it does not target, it simply is what it is. And what it is, I said, is a species that came through something. That came through everything, she said. If the records the Confederation has compiled on human space across 500 years of prohibition, adjacent study are accurate, and I have read most of them, and I believe they are accurate, then humanity is the only known civilization to have an extinction threshold and returned. Not near extinction, not catastrophic reduction. Extinction, close enough that the distinction is academic. They came through it. And whatever they were before that threshold, they are not that now. The beacon's language is very precise about the distinction between not pursuing and not hunting. They marked it. It matters to them. They let you go, I said. They let us go. I thought about that. I thought about Drethervan's voice making the entry about the Carthary Vel. No debris, no indication. And then, much later, his single flat sentence about the vel-sothari disappearing. I thought about Seveldrath's 11 words on day 3, and her 43 words on day 87. I thought about the word tended. The thesis. I said yes. The prohibition is not political mythology. No, she said, it is not. It is a designation made by people who encountered something they could not categorize and drew the only conclusion available to them. Leave it alone. Do not go back. Warn the next ones, and the next ones went anyway. Some did, she said. Most of the time the warning held. The Ordathi held it for 200 years before a border dispute pushed 3 of their ships across the line. The Keth Compact held it for a century before a faction within their military argued, as you argued, that the designation lacked contemporary justification. The vel-sothari held it for 60 years before the compact decided the prohibition was administrative convention. She looked at the chip in the reader housing. The warning holds until someone decides it doesn't apply to them. Then the sector does what the sector does. And eventually there is a new warning, and someone holds it for a while, and eventually someone else decides it doesn't apply to them. That is a terrible pattern, I said. It is the pattern, she said. Cannot tell you it has an end. I left the annex an hour later. I walked through the academy's outer corridor in the artificial day cycle. In the light the station maintains for the standard working hours, and I felt the cold from the annex still in my clothes, particular preserved cold of a room where things are sealed against deterioration. I did not return to my quarters immediately. I walked to the academy's observation deck, a long transparent walled corridor on the station's outer ring, looking out into the void. From there, on a clear sight, you could see the arm of the galaxy spread in the distance, the long pale scatter of light that was not from this angle, distinguishable as stars but only as a collective glow. I stood there for a while. I tried to identify human space from that angle and could not. It was in a different part of the arm, not visible from the observation deck. But I found myself looking at the collective glow anyway, and trying to understand what Seveldrath had meant by tended. Not guarded, not patrolled, not defended. Tended. The word a caretaker uses. What tends a sector? What makes a region of space into something that produces a consistent outcome for incursion across 500 years without an active fleet, without a weapon system on the boundary, without any visible enforcement? What kind of history does a civilization have to carry to make the space around it function that way? I thought about what vel-sothari had said. An extinction threshold. Not near extinction, the thing itself, or close enough, and then returned. Covered. The word recovered implies a continuity, a return to the prior state. Returned. Present again. Changed in ways that the records the Confederation had compiled across 500 years had not been sufficient to fully characterize. I thought about the beacon, the language of the message. The losses you have sustained are not punishment. They are a consequence of the conditions this sector's history has produced. Not an apology, not a justification, an explanation, precise and quiet. And then at the end, we are aware of your presence. We will not interfere with your departure. They had watched the vel-sothari survey enter the sector. They had watched 6 ships disappear over 44 days. They had watched 2 more ships disappear on the return. And when the Sarathavane was close enough to the boundary to receive the beacon, they had sent one message. And then they had watched the Sarathavane leave, and they had not followed. I did not know what to do with the word tended. I still do not. I have been living with it for 20 years, and I am not certain it is the right word, and I am equally uncertain that a better word exists. The next morning I submitted a formal request for a posting transfer to the Outer Margin Survey Station at vel-sothari 3, which was the farthest permanent Confederation station from the prohibited zone that was still accessible on the standard transit routes. The candidacy board approved the transfer. My thesis was formally withdrawn from the candidacy record. No explanation was required for the withdrawal. The board does not ask for one when a candidate transfer after completing supervised archive work at the Hall of Excluded Designations. It is not the first withdrawal of that kind. It is not the last. Vel-sothari and I did not speak again. I did not look for the opportunity, and I do not think she expected me to. We had done what we came to do. She had shown me what there was to see. I had seen it. I have been at vel-sothari 3 for 20 years now. I do cartographic work, which is not what I had planned. It is honest work and it suits me. We chart the margins. The regions the Confederation has not yet fully surveyed, the sectors on the outer arm where the stellar density thins and the navigation charts have blank spaces that are genuinely blank, not forbidden, just undocumented, awaiting the patient work of mapping. I find that I am good at it. The work requires a tolerance for absence, for looking at a blank on a chart and understanding that the blank means you do not yet know what is there, not that nothing is there. I have, it turns out, the right disposition for that kind of work. I have not returned to the Hall of Excluded Designations. I have not requested access to any further records on human space, the Prohibition, or the surveys. I have not continued the thesis research in any form. What I have done once is check the current Confederation archive for updates to the human space Prohibition file. The file is the same length it was when I was a candidate. The 11 sentences that summarize the vel-sothari survey are the same sentences. No new information. No additional public record of the unedited log or what it contains. A candidate arriving at the academy today and reading the file would find exactly what I found. A thin official record that looks, to a careful reader trained in evidential analysis, precisely like an institutionally maintained mythology. The candidate might write a thesis. I also checked, because I had the access, the recent border incident file for the prohibited zone. I was looking to see if any new species had attempted a crossing since the vel-sothari survey. Not the major civilizations, they hold the warning. I was looking for the smaller actors, the ones who come late to the Galactic record, find the Prohibition designation without the generational memory of the previous crossings, who see 11 sentences and calculate the odds. There was one incident on file, 14 years ago. A probe fleet of 4 vessels belonging to a species called the vel-sothari, a young civilization, spacefaring for only 60 years at the time of the incident, with no prior diplomatic contact with the Confederation, and no access to the Prohibition's associated case history. They sent 4 survey probes into the prohibited zone. The probe record, the Confederation received from the vel-sothari's own sensor relay before the probes crossed the boundary, showed standard survey protocols, standard approach trajectories, standard pre-entry documentation, the same things the vel-sothari survey had shown 60 years earlier, its way to a different conclusion than its commanders expected. The probes did not return. No wreckage, no distress signal, no transmission after the boundary crossing. The vel-sothari's government submitted a formal inquiry to the Confederation asking what the Prohibition zone contained and why their probes had not returned. The Confederation's response was 11 sentences long. The vel-sothari submitted a follow-up inquiry asking for clarification. That inquiry is, as of the last date I checked, still pending review. I do not know what they will decide when the response arrives. I do not know if the 11 sentences will hold the line for them, or whether they will reach the same conclusion that the vel-sothari compact reached 60 years. After receiving their own version of the same 11 sentences. I know what the sector will do if they send another fleet. I know what the sector has done, consistently and without variation, 500 years of recorded incursions, and I know that consistency is not the product of a weapon system or a patrol fleet or a political designation. I know what Seveldrath meant when she wrote that it felt tended. I know that the beacon is still there, placing the same message on rotation through 11 galactic standard languages, waiting to be received by whoever gets close enough to the boundary to receive it. And I know, because the record shows it, and because I have spent 20 years doing the kind of patient cartographic work that teaches you how information moves across a region over time, that the beacon was placed with the full knowledge that most of the civilizations who would one day receive its message would not do so until after they had already sustained losses. Not as a warning placed too late, as a message for whoever survived long enough to make the return. I am 61 years old. I will likely spend the rest of my working years at vel-sothari 3, charting margins, filing the blank spaces. I have not spoken publicly about what I know of the vel-sothari survey's unedited record. I will not speak publicly about it. The record is held at the classification level vel-sothari holds it, and it should remain there. What I will say, and have said when young officers at the station ask me why I chose a posting this far from the core, is this. There is a sector in the inner arm that the Confederation designates as prohibited. The designation has been in place for 500 years. In that time, no fleet that has entered the sector in force has returned. The civilizations that have held the designation seriously are still here. The ones that decided the designation lacked contemporary justification are entries in an archive. Do not go there. Not because the galaxy forbids it. Not because an administrative body decided to draw a line. Because the sector is what it is, and what it is reflects what humanity has been, what they passed through, what they carried out the other side, what they made of themselves in the reconstruction. And the galaxy does not have a column in its threat taxonomy for a civilization that has already died once and found the experience instructive. The beacon is still broadcasting. The Keth-Varani inquiry is still pending. Whether those two facts will arrive at the same place before the Keth-Varani make their decision is the kind of question the record cannot answer. The record can only show what has happened before, and what has happened before is consistent, and consistent, in this context, is the only word the archive needs. The warning is on record. It will remain on record. Whether that is enough has never been a question the record was designed to answer.